In 1802, 30,000 men were sent across the Atlantic on a mission to end a revolution by any means necessary, and the vast majority of these men would not make it back home. On arrival, they would be shocked by the impossible terrain, horrible tropical diseases, and the fearless resistance that they would be up against. Their destination was the colony of Saint-Domingue, and the instigator of this trip was the first consul of France, Napoleon Bonaparte. So it'd be a terrible decision for Napoleon, one that he lamented later in life, calling it one of his greatest mistakes. So in 1801, Napoleon is wrapping up the War of the Second Coalition, and for the first time in his consulship, he could really focus on the internal affairs of his empire. And one thing that he needed most at this time was money. There was an obvious place he could get it, the colony of Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue was once a very profitable colony for the French, but that had changed over the last decade. And that was due to the constant fighting on the island that had been happening since the slave revolt of 1791. So now Saint-Domingue was just beginning to restabilize under the direction of a great leader who emerged, named Toussaint L'Ouverture. But Napoleon didn't love the direction that this guy was taking things. Louverture claimed that he wanted to remain loyal to France, but his actions suggested otherwise. He had recently taken over the neighboring territory of Saint-Domingue, and he had written a new constitution for his people, without asking for permission from the French. Napoleon felt that to get the colony back on track, it would require Louverture to be overthrown and for slavery to be reinstated. He knew that the people on the island were not going to love that idea, so he put together this multi-step plan, basically to deceive the people of Saint-Domingue, to quietly remove Toussaint L'Ouverture, and then when order was restored, to bring back slavery. Napoleon then got his brother-in-law, Charles Leclerc, to carry out this plan. Leclerc was a terrible choice for this operation. He had a bad combination of no military experience and a racist worldview that led him to believe this would be a smooth and easy operation. So Leclerc gathers his fighting force and he shows up on the island in 1802, spreading his men out across multiple ports. And even their initial landing wasn't easy. Despite what they had claimed, Louverture knew immediately that the French did not have good intentions. So instead of letting them get on to land unbothered, he had his generals torch the towns that the French were using to embark and also eliminated the supplies that the French were hoping to use. And this was all part of Louverture's grand strategy in this campaign. He did not have the manpower to fight the French head-on, so he opted for a scorched earth approach. If he could drag the war out, he would have his greatest advantage show up in the spring, the rainy season. The rainy season meant mosquitoes, and mosquitoes meant yellow fever. Now, if you are unfamiliar with yellow fever, it's a horror show. I found a great description of it from the historian Evan Thomas, who wrote about it in his book about the Spanish-American War, The War Lovers, where he wrote, quote, "The mosquito-borne infection essentially melted soft tissues so that the sufferers bled from the nose and gums, rectums and genitals, and vomited up something that looked roughly like coffee grounds, but was actually stomach lining and intestines. Howling and ranting as they bled from every orifice, patients had to be tied down in bed so they would not splatter the infections around the wards." End quote. Jesus Christ. So, Louverture knew that the French would be susceptible to this disease, and that it would devastate their army in time. He just needed that time. So the French managed to take the coast of the island, but have real trouble with the interior. The interior of this island is dense and mountainous, and the former slaves had a big advantage of knowing where they were going. The French would be ambushed at every turn, and were not able to land a clean shot on the revolutionaries. But at the same time, Louverture's supplies and manpower were dwindling. And he was no spring chicken here. He had been at war for over a decade, and it might have been wearing him down at this point. And to add to Louverture's woes, some of his allies abandoned him and started cooperating with the French. They had been lured by Leclerc's false promises and were willing to make a deal. So after months of fighting and division amongst the revolutionaries, the French got the upper hand and forced Toussaint L'Ouverture to come to the negotiating table. They promised him that if he laid down his arms, he and his staff could be incorporated into the French army, and that they could work together in the future. But this was all a ruse, and when Louverture was vulnerable, they had him arrested and shipped off to France. Sadly, he would die a year later in a castle in the Jura Mountains. He was held in a cold cell where he would write to Napoleon, trying to convince him that they could work something out. But Napoleon never responded. Now, on the island, the removal of Louverture, combined with news from the nearby island of Guadeloupe that slavery was being reinstated, threw the population into another revolt. and the violence really kicked up a notch. That fall, Leclerc himself died of yellow fever, and he was replaced by one of his generals named Rochambeau. This guy was a total sadist. He reportedly used mass drownings and unfed pit bulls to carry out executions. The revolutionaries then coalesced under the leadership of one of Toussaint's former generals, named Jean-Jacques Dessalines. In the past, Dessalines had been known as Louverture's muscle, and without Louverture to keep him in check, he would carry out his own killings of French collaborators. The conflict by now had become crystal clear for them. Fight or die in chains. With this second wind, the revolutionaries took more and more territory back from the French. And as Louverture predicted, yellow fever was running rampant through the French army. And by the fall of 1803, Rochambeau was pinned down to a small corner of Saint-Domingue. He would have his last stand at the Battle of Vertières on November 18, 1803, where he and what was left of the French army would try and fail to hold back a siege from the revolutionaries. The next morning, Rochambeau had to surrender. He got 10 days to pack up and leave the island with his remaining forces. He left the sick and wounded behind, and they would be drowned a few days later. In the immediate aftermath, Dessalines declared independence for his people and ditched the name Saint-Domingue for their new nation, opting instead for the native name of the island, Haiti. And this new Black Republic would now enter the world stage, independent but isolated and weary from their long battle for freedom. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you did, it'd be really helpful if you can like and subscribe. And I hope to see you next time.